class with Dr. W. and our continuing study of the year 1968. In these final few lectures, we'll now turn to an examination of the popular culture in the country in 1968. Now that we've studied the many events of that year, the cataclysmic clashes of emotions that occurred during the year, it will be possible for us to talk thoroughly about the emotions, thoughts, and motivations behind the books, movies, and music we're going to be talking about in the next several lectures. We'll start in this lecture with a discussion of some of the popular books published in 1968. Some of the most popular and best-selling books of the year 1968 came in a relatively new genre that was known as creative nonfiction, or sometimes called new journalism. The unique elements of this genre of writing were that it involved the author himself or herself inserted into the action. They were journalistic in the sense that research was done and they were essentially nonfiction. At the same time, there were elements of the works that were biographical, or in some ways even fictional, in the sense that the authors took some liberties in filling in a few of the gaps along the way if they didn't know exactly what the dialogue was in a particular moment or exactly the events as they happen. So this is creative nonfiction. One of the best-selling and most popular authors in this new genre was Norman Mailer, who published a couple of highly selling books during that year. The book was written about the October 1967 March on the Pentagon and the anti-war Vietnam protest in Washington, D.C. I described these briefly in an earlier lecture. Abby Hoffman was there and played a key role, and Norman Mailer was there and witnessed the events firsthand. With self-deprecating wit, Mailer describes the quirky, odd, and yet large and in some ways effective protests, and also describes his own small role in the proceedings, as he ended up getting arrested and spending a night in jail. The novel was greeted with critical acclaim and is credited by many with developing this new genre of creative nonfiction. It was also called a nonfiction novel and went on to win the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. The same year, Mailer began work on his next project, called Miami and the Siege of Chicago, which was written about the Republican and Democratic National Conventions of 1968, which I've already discussed in previous lectures. Again, Mailer inserted himself into the action in the third person, referring to himself as the reporter. His accounts of these conventions go down as important primary sources related to those conventions, as he was there on the ground in both cases, witnessing the events up close and personal. The style is similar to Armies of the Night, and yet to some critics it was already becoming tiresome, as this gambit of inserting himself in third person as the reporter was a little bit tiresome for some readers. There are also a few controversial aspects of the work, as he does kind of point the finger at both the protesters outside of the convention and the proceedings inside. He doesn't seem to take favorites and is free to criticize both sides as well. There are some plainly honest moments that were controversial in this book, as when he wrote this about the protest going on in Chicago outside of the convention. He said, "The reporter became aware, after a while, of a curious emotion in himself, for he had not ever felt it consciously before. It was a simple emotion and very unpleasant to him. He was getting tired of Negroes and their rights. It was a miserable recognition, and on many account, for if even he felt this way, then what immeasurable tides of rage must be loose in America itself." Similarly, he addressed a small sense of pleasure in witnessing the violence outside of Chicago as the police battered the protesters, whom again he was beginning to find tiresome. And while he took some criticism for expressing these views openly in his book, I think Mailer's work does point to the rise of Nixon and the so-called silent majority that many Americans agreed with Mailer's perspective that the protests and the protesters were becoming tiresome. Another of the prominent writers in this genre of creative nonfiction, these nonfiction factual accounts of events going on, but written in the first person and in very creative style, was Tom Wolfe, one of America's great modern authors. Wolfe actually published two books on the same day in 1968, The Pump House Gang and The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. While both of them were well received and became bestsellers, it's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test that is the better remembered of the two and still widely read even today. The two books both go down as first-person accounts of the events of the 1960s. The Pump House Gang, written about his own travels in 1955 and 1966, during which he spent extensive time with figures such as Hugh Hefner, some of the models, and others in the mid-1960s who were engaging in various kind of exploits. The book is a series of essays that talk about this new kind of culture of the 1960s and sort of the lifestyles of the rich and famous in that era. Here's an excerpt from Time magazine's review of the Pump House Gang. He uses a language that explodes with comic book words like pow and boing. His sentences are shot with ellipses, stabbed with exclamation points, or bombarded with long lists of brand names and anatomical terms. He is irritating, but he did develop a new journalistic idiom that has brought relief from standard middle-high journalese. The better known of Wolfe's two 1968 publications was The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which was a story written about Ken Kesey and his friends who were known as the Merry Pranksters, who in 1964 had driven across the country in a colorfully painted school bus, which they nicknamed Further, using LSD and other psychedelic drugs along the way. So they traveled across the country on their way to meet with the band known as the Warlocks, which would later become known as the Grateful Dead. Ken Kesey was an important figure in his own right. He is best known as the author of the famous novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and back in the late 1950s, he had become part of a government program experimenting in the use of psychedelic drugs like LSD, which became the heart of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was written in 1962. Kesey is considered one of the links or ties between the Beat generation of the 50s and the hippies of the 1960s, which again I described in a previous lecture. As Kesey said, I was too young to be a beatnik and too old to be a hippie, and therefore he becomes a little bit of both and a bridge between the two. The book describes the journeys of this band of so-called merry pranksters, their ceaseless use of psychedelic drugs along the way, and their unique and sort of mind-opening interpretations of everyday life. Of all the books published in 1968, this one might stand as the best kind of true representative of what life was like for Americans in that era. And it widely contributed to the idea of sex, drugs, and rock and roll as a mantra of the late 1960s. Another popular American author who published a book in 1968 was Kurt Vonnegut, who published Welcome to the Monkey House, a collection of short stories, which ranged widely across a number of topics, from science fiction to down in the dirt, gritty, just stories of American life. The stories had all appeared in magazines at one time or another, so they were already published, and some critics critiqued the work as this kind of magazine fiction that was not on par with much of Vonnegut's other works. Like many of Vonnegut's works, Welcome to the Monkey House takes a critical and kind of sarcastic look at the troubles of American life and commercialism and the perpetuation of atomic weapons and bombs and so on. It looks at kind of the great problems of the country and the world. And one of the stories proposes a solution to the problem of overpopulation, which was much talked about in 1968, and I'll mention more about that in just a minute. But in Welcome to the Monkey House, the solution that Vonnegut envisions is to remove the pleasure from sex by desensitizing humans' lower extremities, and therefore people stop procreating. This is the kind of irreverent view that Vonnegut was known for, and while Welcome to the Monkey House sold well, it generally fell short of some of the other classics that he published in his career. Another of the best-selling books published in 1968 was The Teachings of Don Juan, written by Carlos Castaneda, a Peruvian-born American author. Americans and others bought this book in droves. It was written about Castaneda's experiences with a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan Matus. Part of the issue with this book is it was never clear, and remains unclear even now, how much of the book was actually true and how much was simply fictional and made up, and even if this figure of Don Juan ever existed at all. Many who praised and embraced the book particularly appreciated its recognition of indigenous people and their traditional ways, what Castaneda described as the Yaqui way of knowledge, using psychedelic effects of plants like peyote and datura to create visions and dreams. Critics of the work again point to the fact that there's no evidence that any of it ever happened at all, and that Castaneda's methods and claims were shoddy and can't be proven. Whether it was true or not, Castaneda's book was filled with interesting and beautiful and colorful and intriguing stories and events, and again, the book sold by the millions. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about books published in 1968, focusing on nonfiction and